What is going on, everybody? This is TAETRO, your electronic music mentor, back with a brand new episode of the TAETRO Radio Podcast. If you don't know, this podcast is all about taking music from home studio producers around the world. Like for today's episode, we've got 3 submissions from New York City, Ireland, and Santiago, Chile. And I like to review those tracks submitted by these producers. I don't think there's a lot of other podcasts out there for some of the more independent amateur producers to get real feedback and to get a platform where people can hear their music. And that's one thing that was important to me when I started my channel and started gaining an audience is how can I use my platform to uplift other artists that maybe need some exposure or even need to learn something about music production and can improve their music. So I'm super excited to have the podcast back, and there's going to be a new way to get involved and submit music to the podcast, but I'll talk about that later after our first track, which is going to be by an artist named Blue Sirens from New York City. The track is called Ghost Lullabies, and Blue Sirens says, "First try for a more lo-fi chill song, wrote it on a rainy day, thinking of how the melody would bounce between certain notes to lean into a relaxing mood for the listener. Hope you enjoy." Alright, that was Ghost Lullabies by Sirens, and I really love this track. It's a very poppy track, and I'm really impressed that this is your first attempt at a lo-fi chill song, because it really just has a great uplifting vibe. I think a lot of lo-fi music can tend to trend sort of sad, so I was happy to hear this track, and if I had to use one word to describe it, it would definitely be sweet. Like, it reminded me of candy, or even if you look at the album art, it has a very candy sweet kind of vibe, and that is exemplified through the main melody that plays through the track. I think that that's a great melody you have there. I would have loved to hear that melody layered up an octave on another instrument, maybe like a piano or a music box, especially at the end, because as this track evolves, we're hearing the melody multiple times over the course of the track. And even though it is such a great melody, I would have loved to hear some evolution, and layering is a good way to evolve the sound of that melody without actually changing the notes themselves. From about a minute 19 to about 2:17, we lose the backbeat, and right at the end of that sort of drop period at around 2:17, a short swell comes in and builds some tension back up and right back into having that beat back. I would have loved that tension to have built longer over that almost minute span, because like I said, from about a minute 19 to 2:17, there's no backbeat. It's very, very chill. I totally get that, but I would have loved to have felt that we were building towards something. So maybe some way to add some more tension, some more swells that signifies that we're building towards a bigger drop. I think I heard some field recordings at the end, barely. Like, I'm not sure if I was imagining that or if I was hoping I was hearing that, but if that's true, more of that for sure. Like, I love using field recordings in my intros and my outros, and especially for this genre, the chill genre, when you're really transporting the listener to a space, whether that's by mood or by in their imagination, they're in a different place. Field recordings can really help set that scene for the track. So thank you so much, Sirens, for submitting that track. I really hope that you continue on in making some lo-fi chill tracks, and would love to have you back on the podcast again soon. So we've got 2 more tracks in this episode to go through. But before we do that, I wanted to maybe quickly talk about how you get your music on this podcast and just the evolution of the TAETRO community in general. So if you had listened to this podcast before, you know that I was taking submissions from my TAETRO Community Facebook group, which was all well and good for the earlier part of my channel because Facebook was kind of an easy way to connect, but it's really not so much anymore, and it kind of faded away. So I was trying to revamp this and figure out how can we best gather as a community online and chat, and people can get help from each other, because the whole purpose of the community is not just to submit music for a podcast. It's so you have a community of other home studio producers who are all learning to create music, buying gear, troubleshooting problems, and working together to sort of do that and grow as artists. And one of the best platforms I figured for that would be Discord, because it's a chat room, and I don't know too much about Discord. I just knew it would be a great chat experience, and we could have different channels for different things, and that's what we have now. We have a TAETRO Community Discord channel. We've got channels for tech support, we've got channels for submitting music to this podcast. I like to drop my new videos a little bit early in that Discord as well whenever I can, and the way to get into that channel and also support and get a little more perks would be to join at patreon.com/TAETRO. Now, I've recently revamped the Patreon, so there's way better perks than there ever have been before, and you can join at any level from $1 on up, and you will have access to this Discord where you can chat with other home studio producers from around the world, like I said, and also submit music to this podcast. But there's other perks, including exclusive live streams, music downloads, and even private one-on-one lessons with me. So if that's something you're interested in and you want to get your music on the podcast, you can join today for as little as $1 per month at patreon.com/TAETRO. Right, so the next track is called Tu Calma, piano version, from an artist called Reprodestruxion from Santiago, Chile. The artist notes that this is a solo project with some collaborators, and he hopes to eventually evolve it into a live band scenario. The track is a pared down version of a more electronic new wave pop tune that he still has to finish. He did the bass line on piano and doubled it on the Chapman stick, which is an instrument I had to look up, and maybe during this track you can look it up too to see what it looks like. Basically, it looks like a really cool stringed instrument, kind of a guitar but with way more strings. He says, a friend of mine played the Chapman stick and guitars. I EQ'd and did the effects on Ableton and Guitar Rig. Let's give it a listen.
Sin razones para seguir, temo cercar.
Alright, that was Reprodestruxion with To Calma, the piano version. This is definitely a different track than I'm used to listening to on the podcast. I'm really interested to hear what the final, more electronic version will sound like, this being the piano acoustic version. But that being said, I really liked the intro because knowing how the track evolves in the end, where it's got some acoustic elements, but it also has some electronic elements, you kind of did some foreshadowing with that, where we're hearing piano at the beginning with some scattered delay, so it has an electronic feel, and there's also some bit crushed sounds, which tells us there's a little something more to this track than just a normal acoustic track coming, and I like that foreshadowing. I'd never heard of the Chapman stick before, so I'm really glad I got to experience that, and I think doubling the piano and the bass line like you did, I think that's always effective. I think if you double something really strong, whether it's a melody like we talked about with the last track, or like with the bass line, which is probably one of the strongest features of this track, doubling it on another instrument tells the listener like, hey, listen to this, hear this line, this is what I want you to listen to. I have some notes about the mix here, so we gotta be really, really careful with the lower frequencies. I can hear the bass line. I think the bass line could actually use a little bit of a low end boost, but there's a lot of extra stuff that's kind of cluttering up the low end of the mix of this track. Try sweeping out the low frequencies of basically any instrument that isn't your bass or your kick. Like, that's just a general mixing technique anyway. If something doesn't need to have low end in it, just clear out the low end regardless of if you can hear it or not, and your mix will automatically be taken to the next level just by doing that. But especially on some of your sounds, like the distorted and the washy instruments, there's some lower piano, I want to say like smashes happening that are sort of like chromatic or atonal. Those have a lot of like low end that I hear the content of the, you know, out of key, and I think that's fine to have that as a feature, but there's a little bit of a thud happening with them too, so I would just take the low end out of those. There's also a bass drum hit or some drum hit at 228 that really sticks out, and it sounds like it should be more of a boom, but it's actually like hitting in a weird mid-range spot that I thought was kind of jarring, so I'd be kind of aware of that. Maybe record a deeper drum or pitch that sound down to make it have more of that boom sound that I think you are going for. The stereo image sounds pretty good. I liked how there was different things happening across the stereo image. That makes a mix really interesting to listen to. The hi-hats though sounded a little bit kind of dead center or close to the center. I would have moved those out of the center to make a little more room for the vocals and the bass line, because those are really the features of the track. And maybe a little less reverb on the percussion, because there's a lot of reverb washy stuff happening on this track anyway. And if you take a little bit off the percussion, it's actually going to help to anchor your track and not have it be so floaty. And the vocals on that note reminded me of Trent Reznor, which I think is pretty cool. I would probably compress the vocal track a little bit more. It sounded a little bit not super even the whole time through. So just maybe compressing it a bit more and using a little bit less of the distorted grit sound, because anytime you're using any kind of distortion, you know, a little goes a long way. So maybe dial that back a little and give it a nice compression, you know, 3-to-1 ratio, bring the threshold down to somewhere between 20 and 30, and that'll really even it out in the mix. But thank you so much for submitting this track. It's also probably a good time to note, as we head into our last tune, which is a really fun drum and bass tune, that you can find all the links to these artists and their tracks in the description of this podcast. And I highly, highly, highly recommend that you do that, because the way we kind of can support each other is by, you know, giving each other a follow, especially when a lot of the artists on this podcast are lesser known artists. And if you like what you hear, you should at least head to their profile and just, you know, show them some love. Even if you just drop a like on their track or you add one of their tracks to your playlist, it would mean a lot to me, and I'm sure it would mean a lot to these artists. All right, last but certainly not least, we have a track by an artist called Mose G from Ireland. The track is called Maniac, and Mose G is a drum and bass producer. He says the Maniac track is a minimalistic, deep drum and bass roller. Let's listen. All right, that was Maniac by Mose G. This has a very techie cyberpunk vibes, reminded me of The Matrix, and that's always a good thing. The evolution is great. So one thing I think is really, really important in electronic music, and especially if you want to keep people listening for a while, is you gotta switch things up every 8 bars. You want to hear something new every 4 to 8 bars, depending on the sections of your song. Introduce something new, whether it's a new sound or even if it means dropping something out. This is a composition technique that I use in most of my music. So not only as a producer, but as a listener, I get bored really easy. I have a short attention span, and I know there's a lot of longer music out there that can, go for long sections without much change, but I just have a short attention span, so I like to change things up every 4 to 8 bars, and it doesn't have to be drastic. It can be as simple as adding another hi-hat, or a lot of what happened in this track was adding different percussion layers that just did enough to keep me listening through the whole track. One thing I noticed was you usually drop the drums between those sections, which is definitely an effective technique and a common technique in electronic music, right before the next downbeat of a new section, you drop the drums out and it creates nice tension and release once the drums hit back in again. But I noticed that it almost happens every single time, like every single change in this track. And I think there's some ways to mix it up instead of just clean cutting the drums out of those sections each time. Maybe try adding drum fills, which I know there's some in this track, but maybe doing that a little bit more, or even filtering them out or bringing the filter up over time towards the next section rather than just dropping them. It did stand out to me that kind of like every section the drums dropped out right before a new drop. Now, I don't know too much about the drum and bass genre. It's not the type of music I normally listen to, but I'm wondering, is the second half of the track different enough? I think in this genre, kind of like what I was talking about before, I have a short attention span. I think with this genre, you have lots of different rhythms and lots of different layers that come in and out to keep things interesting. But I wonder if there could be one extra layer towards the second half of this track that brings us home to the end, that, maybe adds another layer of epicness, because there's a lot of frenetic sounds happening, sounds happening all over the place and fast, and they sound really interesting, but could there be something that's constant? So like a held note, a held higher note, something like with a string vibe, but obviously a synth, because this is an electronic track, I don't think strings would fit, but something that sits higher up in the melodic spectrum and is just kind of like a held note that anchors the final section and gives it a sort of epic ending vibe that is different from the beginning, or at least adding that one more layer of difference for the second half of the tune, I think would have helped the ending a lot more, for me at least. But yeah, MuzG, thank you so much for submitting this track. I really love listening to it, love the Matrix cyberpunk kind of vibes that it gave me. So that was our final track of the episode, and before we go, I wanted to add a new section to the podcast to close things out. If I'm supposed to be the electronic music mentor, then I think we should end things on a mentoring moment, where I sort of give some words of wisdom, some words of mentorship at the end of the episode that you can then take with you onto your creative life, whether that's producing music or making any type of art, really. So right now, if you're a creative person, I can guarantee there is something, some project or some aspect of what you do that you have not started yet because you feel like you just don't have the skills, or something you haven't put out, whether it's a track, a video, a piece of art, because you feel like it's just straight up not good enough and not ready. And sometimes that filter is okay. It's okay to have that standard of kind of what your work should be, and a level of like, I'm not going to put something out unless it's to this level of quality. But especially beginners, and especially if you end up being stagnant and not releasing anything for a really long amount of time, longer than you would have hoped, then we need to play with that standard. Because it's better for you to release your art or your track and get feedback on it and have that experience of releasing something to the world and putting it out there as best as you can in that moment. Because you can sit on tracks forever. Tracks can be sitting on your hard drive, and you might say, oh, I'm going to release this when I do that next mix, and suddenly you're on mix 27 and it's been 6 months and you haven't released anything. And we really want to avoid that. So you can still have the filter and have the ability to say, you know, I want to put out X quality work. But in the internet age where we can constantly be posting things, we can keep up a pace where our constant improvements can go noticed. Like, we can keep releasing tracks that people hear the difference between your track 6 months ago and your track today. And that's kind of what's great about the platforms we have, is it's basically a news feed. The old stuff gets pushed down and the new stuff goes to the top. So it's almost like a motivating factor. I would say you're undoubtedly going to improve from one track to the next, even if it's incremental. So no matter if you release a track today, tomorrow's track is going to be better. And when you release tomorrow's track, it pushes yesterday's track down in the queue. So what are more people going to see and hear? The latest track that has your latest skill level exemplified in it, no matter what that skill level is. But we all have to go on that journey, and if you keep delaying that journey by saying, no, it's not good enough, no, I can't put it out, then you're really only delaying your own improvement journey. So that's my mentoring moment for this week's podcast. I want to thank all the artists for submitting. I was really happy to bring the podcast back in this way and have these great tracks to start it off with. I'll be back next week with an all-new episode of TAETRO Radio. And don't forget that this podcast is made possible by support from the channel. So if you want to get your music on the podcast and you also want to become a part of a community of like-minded home studio musicians from around the world, you should head to patreon.com/TAETRO. Join at any level from $1 up and be able to submit your music to this podcast and become a part of a really great community. Higher tiers have more rewards like exclusive live streams and private lessons, music downloads, early access to content, all that good stuff. If you have a moment and you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and share this podcast with a fellow home studio music producer who you think might be interested. Thank you so much for listening. This has been TAETRO, your electronic music mentor. Have a good one.